Welcome to the Zinnov Podcast, Decoding Private Equity series, where we bring to you in-depth conversations with practitioners and leaders on the hottest PE deals, their investment theses, and a lowdown on industries where all the action is.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Decoding Private Equity series by Zinnov. I'm Amita Goyal, Managing Partner at Zinnov and your host for today. Today, I have with me Tom Stephens, Operating Partner at BV Investment Partners, one of the North America's longest standing sector-focused PE firms, with roughly $5.7 billion invested across tech-enabled business services, software, and IT services. Tom also serves on the board of several BV portfolio companies. He brings more than 2 decades of leadership and tech-enabled services and software experience. Before joining BV in 2021, he shaped global corporate strategy at Cognizant, led commercial transformation at Etivio, later acquired by ServiceNow, and co-headed the consulting practice at Bulger Partners, which EY ultimately acquired. Today, he pairs his operator pedigree with an investor's lens, helping BV's companies accelerate go-to-market execution, scale globally, and capture operational upside. Tom holds an AB in computer science from Dartmouth and an MBA from MIT Sloan of Management, giving him a rare blend of technical fluency and board-level strategic vision. Tom, we are thrilled to have you on the show. Welcome to the Decoding Private Equity series.
Amita, thank you so much. What a kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be here.
Wonderful. Let's dive in on our topic of interest. So, Tom, you've had so much experience working with so many portfolio companies, building offshore and global capability centers, talent capabilities. Offshore and nearshore centers are usually thought of as the traditional home for IT or software or R&D. From what you have seen, where have these hubs added value in the less obvious parts of business?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And what I've seen is our portfolio companies often think of IT, software development, and other sort of technical skill sets when they think of offshore talent. But what we've seen is there's a few characteristics of those sort of more traditional processes that in our minds make those technical roles a good fit for global talent. So for example, things like sales operations, many pieces of the marketing function, we see a lot of value in moving to global centers. Portions of finance and accounting for sure. But for us, what we've seen is for those sort of G&A functions, it's hard for us to really justify going to a global delivery model just for those pieces. So you mentioned we invest in tech-enabled services typically, where call it 70% of our cost base is in core client delivery. And so that's typically where we look to start. But that core client delivery spans a pretty broad range of domains and markets. So everything from outsourced accounting services to medical billing, coding to alarm monitoring and security services. So we've seen a pretty broad range of these things, hard to narrow it down to just a few.
That's wonderful. The wide variety of examples you're giving are a clear demonstration of it's not just an IT and R&D, but across different functions, one could leverage global talent. If you could share like a real world example where a global center drove innovation or agility in a function beyond the software or engineering from your experience, please.
Yeah, sure. So one of my favorites is a business that we have that serves mid-market health insurers in the United States. And their range of services are really all focused on back office processing of claims and member communications. And so this is a business that began by moving much of their what I'd call data processing of that core client delivery to a location in the Philippines. And we were able to find a very good talent pool in the Philippines for that and scale it up. And from there, we were able to add to it a number of other functions that could just expand the value of that asset. So for example, we began moving some customer support and and member communications activities offshore. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a number of G&A functions where, since we had the infrastructure, we had the office, we had local leadership in place who could oversee and develop these capabilities. We're able to do some of our HR processing, finance and accounting functions, and even some sales operations, right? As we made acquisitions into this business, it was a major source of synergy value for these smaller acquired companies that did not have this capability, to be able to shift some of their processing and activities offshore. How do we prioritize all these things? So we're able to do a lot of that work from these global centers, which just, and I try to be careful because it often comes across sounding we can just do it less expensively. But to us, often the real value is we can afford to do it better, faster, and more completely, right? When we do it in an offshore location where we have access to very high quality talent that's not as expensive as we'd have to pay in New York or Chicago or wherever our businesses might happen to be.
That's wonderful. That actually is a great segue to my next question, Tom. Cost is a very clear ROI, but beyond cost, what are some of the intangible or long-term metrics that you look for to achieve?
Right. And so, in practical terms, we're often falling back on cost as the key metric to ROI. And certainly, as we're considering building this capability for the first time in a business, to be convincing to a CFO or a board, it often comes down to what is the profit ROI on this, but by doing things more cheaply. But to me, what our mission is with these businesses is to make them fundamentally more valuable and scalable enterprises for the long term. That cost piece is not the main driver of, call it, strategic value, right? So there's a few important pieces. One is simply scalability. So many of our businesses, a core portion of the value proposition is that they are owners of very scarce skill sets that their clients would have a challenge hiring for themselves. And so a core part of the strategic differentiation and value proposition is proprietary access to those scarce skill sets. It allows us to be much more scalable and move these businesses from 50 or 100 million to 500 plus million of revenue, where it would just be very hard to do that from a single location, right, in the United States. There's a second piece of this, and you mentioned speed and agility. That it's easy to underestimate how important that is. And so mechanically, how I think about that is simply, if I'm maintaining my bench of delivery resources in the United States, it's very expensive. So I need to run my businesses at 90% utilization, right, to really drive the profitability that we look to see. Whereas if I have a lower cost offshore location, I can afford to keep a healthier bench, and that lets me, in client conversations, ensure to them that I can start their project right away. I don't have to go staff up to meet their needs. And that is particularly in these markets where we are dealing in scarce resources and scarce skill sets. That is a major differentiator in winning deals. And then finally, there's, I think, an underappreciated benefit of this that I see in just the evolution of the companies that we partner with, which is, I'd call it process maturity, right? And so moving core functions or core client delivery pieces to global talent centers is a very effective catalyst to drive more discipline and maturity in the nature of those processes. We typically partner with businesses that are founder-led. They are mid-size businesses where, not always, but often, a lot of the value is in the sort of institutional knowledge of a handful of very experienced and talented leaders. And they are bringing that expertise to clients by walking the halls, working closely with the more junior team, and sort of through what looks like a sort of apprenticeship model, transferring that knowledge, right? And on one hand, it's one of the challenges of moving to a global delivery center where that model simply doesn't work, where you have major time zone differences and major geographic sort of barriers to that real-time style of communication. And so it forces us to codify more of that knowledge and expertise, to transition to a process that is more segmentable and scalable than it needed to be when these businesses were smaller, but they'll need to be to continue to scale. And so it's often a good catalyst for that because in order to make that global model work, requires a little more thoughtfulness in the process that you're driving.
I love it. I think it just shows the experience you've had. So, have you had an example where you've seen a global center of one of your portfolio companies acquiring a strategic position in the company on the way it was perceived by either the customer or the acquirers or the talent
Mhm.
that they hired?
Yeah, more and more it's becoming perceived as a strategic capability to have access to global talent. And I think my perception is that has long been the case in IT services, right? But as I think about our portfolio of IT services, acquirers typically look for that global model as a signal of sort of maturity and resilience. And I think more and more for other businesses and other segments of the market, it's becoming similarly viewed. And there's a few reasons for that. I think a big one is the scalability that I mentioned. And so from an acquirer's perspective, their mission is scale it quickly. And certainly in the services space, doing that is not just about selling more. You also need to scale the delivery capacity along with what you're selling. And so already having access to these global talent pools just makes that a much easier or more reliable proposition. And I think this notion of process maturity is another one where I think having an effective global delivery model is a strong signal that you have that process maturity and the resilience that comes from it.
Wow. No, I think that's incredible to hear. And you are driving business at a private equity firm, and the acquirer's perspective matters a lot. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. What are the most common misconceptions that you've seen an onshore team have for their counterparts in the offshore or the global center journey?
Mhm. Yeah. Obviously, a lot depends on the backgrounds of the onshore teams. And I often work with onshore teams who have had extensive experience working in global talent models, and it's much less of a shock to them. But take the other cohort where this is their first experience, right? And you know this, you work with global talent all the time. It's so much of simply the mechanical process changes in subtle but important ways where things just aren't going to be as easy in certain circumstances. For example, iterating on some, call it client output, that you used to do by going into a conference room for 45 minutes and flipping pages and talking through stuff. Doesn't work that way anymore. It's often there's a time lag. Often there's a whole day to go back and forth with one iteration. And so you might only get in the span of a week, instead of being able to do 50 versions, really tune things up. That's sort of an extreme example. And similarly, your ability to groom and develop talent is significantly impaired, right? So your reps being able to coach someone, and so that the learning model that you may have relied on, in particularly in services business, that often looks like sort of a classic apprenticeship where there's a lot of interaction, a lot of iteration, a lot of unstructured coaching is not as effective simply because the logistics of it mean there's a lot less of that interaction, right? And then finally, I think the biggest misconception or challenge is that the the team is just going to work in the same ways with the same mindset that you do. Communication styles are very different globally, and what looks like a yes, absolutely, I'm on board in the United States might actually mean I'm not sure about this in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
So figuring out how we can normalize that communication style and really communicate in a transparent and effective way across cultural differences, I've seen as one of the trickier challenges as people are getting used to these models.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. What we have seen there is that, yeah, absolutely. If you distribute the work too much across time zones or locations, then you have to iterate across time zones and locations. But if you try to co-locate as much as possible so that there is some amount of local decision making, that
Mhm.
iteration may not be as required once the team is stable. It's required in the beginning because everyone is new and the system is new. But once you kind of co-locate and have the right set of leadership, then that much iteration is not required, and you actually start leveraging the true intelligence of the team you built in a global setting. So I just wanted to share that.
Amita, that is such an important point, and it's I also think one of the most important design points in thinking through our global talent model. And what I've seen is there's a degree of integration that you can choose. And to your point, trying to make it too integrated creates a number of challenges in terms of just your ability to collaborate, right?
Yes, exactly.
And I think on the other end of that spectrum, there is a danger of trying to segment it too far, where the risk there is you're building a team that does not feel
Yeah.
a team, right? They
Yeah.
they feel separate and isolated, and that creates culture issues, it creates retention issues, it creates a whole host of challenges that are difficult to measure, but fundamentally get in the way of getting value from the
You don't want to create an island.
exactly, exactly. So it's a very difficult balance to strike, and it's very important to think through and experiment with, honestly.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. So, from a leadership's perspective, what qualities do the managers who, are in the onshore team need to have to succeed with their global teams across the border or
Hmm.
in a global location?
Yeah, two I'd call out in particular. One is just what I'd call an open learning mindset, right? I think that I've seen leaders who believe they have all the answers have a very difficult time succeeding in initiating these models. Because as we just discussed, in the transition, a lot changes, and hopefully you learn a lot as you're navigating those changes. The second just really important mindset is, I guess I'd call it resilience, right? And I've never seen one of these transitions go exactly to plan. Things break, things fall down. And so approaching it with the mindset of I'm going to learn where those things didn't go to plan, and I'm going to be flexible and adjust the plan, and but still know that like there's value to be had here, and have the grit and resilience to push through those challenges, I think is super important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's so new in a different country. Could you walk us through some of I mean, we touched upon it briefly in your previous answer, but some of the cultural challenges which you have seen as a pattern that you have to kind of overcome?
Yeah, I think the most fundamental cultural, what I'd call instinct that's important to overcome is that, the home office has all the answers and the global talent center is simply there to fill orders, right? That to the extent that ever works, it's rarely, the highest and best value we can get from the global talent. And so I think going into the initiative with the mindset that this is not going to be a sort of order fulfillment engine, I think is super helpful in succeeding. The second, and we touched on this earlier, but the differences in communication style and tone are where I see a lot of friction come up. And so number one, that communication style can be perceived in global delivery centers in ways that many Americans won't necessarily expect. I won't pretend to know the nuances of every culture in the world, but a common theme I see outside of the United States is a much more gentle and deferential style of disagreement, which many Americans can interpret as agreement, which can lead to, as you might imagine, a lot of frustration for both sides of that conversation.
You're very polite, Tom, and you put it very beautifully, but basically it's very confusing sometimes. I completely understand. We generally try to have, for our, the companies we work with or build global teams for, hire a leader who has had a combination of like global experience. When everything is done virtually, it's a harder code to crack, the cultural code. But when you get people to meet in the same place, go for a lunch or tea and do some training sessions together, they connect so well, then you don't really need a trainer to understand that kind of human bond which they experience firsthand. So if planning for the right budgets when you're starting your global initiatives, to have some kind of a travel budget to and fro both sides, incredibly sets the right tone and the foundation and the bonding between the team. The other thing which we have done consistently is do some kind of business cultural training for both the
Mhm.
team we build new and the team that exists. So
Mhm.
these are the
Mhm.
four things we do: the leadership, the team having international experience or working with international companies, the to and fro travel, and actually doing business culture training for both the teams.
Yeah, I like all those suggestions. In particular, your comment on the travel budget, I think is so important. And shame on me for not mentioning it earlier, but the importance of just showing up and number one, just demonstrating the leadership interest and commitment is critical, right? And we mentioned the danger of creating this isolated island. One of the key ways you prevent that is have onshore leadership and the key people who are engaging with that offshore center show up on a regular basis, and then separately or on a related note, you mentioned it, that there's no number of Zoom meetings that can replace having a cup of coffee with someone
Absolutely,
in terms of
absolutely.
building the relationship. And what I've seen is you can sustain and leverage a relationship for a while over Zoom, but if you haven't built it, if you haven't built the foundation of trust and just shared objectives and that shared humanity, you're never going to get the same level of engagement, collaboration, trust, that stuff. And so I can't overstate the importance of showing up.
Absolutely, everyone wants to feel they belong, and when
Hmm.
leadership shows that commitment, they feel they belong, and it goes a long way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That sounds really great. What would be one of the single most important advice you'd like to give for a smoother start to
Hmm.
someone who's building a global center for the very first time?
Find a great local leader. That makes all the difference, and it's difficult to do. I don't want to uh, lead anyone astray that it's easy, because to find that great local leader means running an effective recruiting process. You need to show up and really vet this leader. And if I could just add a second piece of that, I think back to the point on showing up as you're finding that global leader and as just afterwards, really engaging with integrating that leader into the executive team is important. And that means usually bringing that local leader to your onshore office to make sure that he or she is really getting a sense of the culture and the decision-making style and the personalities, as well as your onshore leadership going and spending time locally as the delivery center is scaling up, I think is important. And that's going to make your local leader much more effective and able to handle many of the speed bumps that happen as you're scaling.
That's amazing, Tom. I think I personally learned a lot. I believed I work a lot with private equity firms and leaders, but I truly learned a lot. So thanks a ton. And I'm sure our audience and the other Ps learn a lot from your experience. To summarize some of the key takeaways, a global center helps build access to talent which is scarce, adds as a differentiator because it adds speed and agility, adds to making it more soundproof your business continuity because you're not depending on few individuals. A catalyst is for codifying how you work again for future. Some of the key things which leaders should keep in mind is they should go with an open mindset because we don't know everything always going in a global location, and create a sense of belongingness by showing up. And hiring the right leader is the key if someone is venturing it the first time. Thank you so much, Tom. It's been incredible talking to you.
Amita, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for the time.
Wonderful. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. We'll be back with more such episodes. Stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Zinnov Podcast Decoding Private Equity series. We hope you enjoyed listening in and found the information shared here useful. You can listen to the other episodes of this podcast series on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Or just visit our website www.zinnov.com or drop us a note at info@zinnov.com to know more.